My name is Panos Pumsis, and I'm your host for today. Today we'll be discussing and featuring really an inspiring thought leader, an academic, a professor, a practitioner, Professor Maurice Mthombeni. I'll be introducing him more in a minute, but first I want to say how thrilled we are all to be starting the Global Executive Leadership Initiative, GELI as we call it, first webinar on featuring Ubuntu leadership. This is a topic of our webinar, and it's really showcasing leadership based on the rich tradition of Africa, and of course, South Africa in particular. And we're really honored to be showcasing and featuring the Ubuntu leadership. The Ubuntu leadership is really relevant for all aspects of life. I would say also very much so for our sector in the humanitarian development sector. I would like to ask you all, as you're listening to Professor Mthombeni, to reflect on your own place and your own position and see what you can take from this conversation that you can right away apply or enhance in the position where we are. Of course, where we talk about the Ubuntu leadership, the African philosophy, which describes how people interact with each other and within their communities. And of course, when we hear about Ubuntu leadership, our thoughts go first to the late former President Nelson Mandela and his incredible manifestation of Ubuntu leadership and what it looked like in the way he showed up as a leader in his carrying his duties. The main tenet of Ubuntu is the belief that a person's existence is dependent on others and how a person interacts with the others. And that's really something that brings a lot of respect for what we're going to hear in a minute. I'd like to say a couple of words now about Professor Maurice Mthombeni. He's the Interim Dean at the Gordon Institute of Business Science, GIBS, as is known, at the Pretoria University. Prior to his appointment, he was the Executive Director of Faculty at GIBS. As an academic, he's a senior lecturer who researches at the intersection of the micro foundations and corporate strategy and corporate governance. At GIBS, he's one of the senior academics in the areas of environment, of business, corporate strategy, and innovation. So I would like to ask you, to encourage you actually to ask questions as we go through this webinar and the presentation. Please feel free to ask the question either at the chat box in the bottom of the screen or at the Q&A at the bottom right part of the screen. The Q&A, the question comes directly to me. And as we will be moving to the second half of the webinar from about 30 minutes past the hour, I will be taking the questions you have sent and asking Professor Mthombeni to give us his reflections on your question. So please feel free to ask questions from the get-go. Don't wait for that point, and we will be taking the questions in the second half of this webinar. And with that, it's my great pleasure, Professor Mthombeni, to give you the floor. We're very much looking forward to hearing your reflections and the words of wisdom that comes from the Ubuntu leadership. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Panos, to you and the team for inviting me to be part of this really important conversation. And I think it comes at a very important time in a global context. There was a time before 2019 when we used to think that the world was VUCA, which stood for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. But we've since learned, since this really insidious disease, this insidious enemy of humanity called the novel coronavirus, that actually we now live in a new world, in a world of VUCA 2.0. And in this world of VUCA 2.0, we're living in a world that is vulnerable, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And those vulnerabilities are unevenly distributed between people from different parts of the world. And if you so wish, they are unevenly distributed between people from the global north and the global south in political economy perspectives. So this concept of urban Ubuntu leadership for me allows us to reflect on the types of leadership that we could bring to bear in this context. And I'm so proud to be speaking to your community, Panos, people that live in a world of Ubuntu, even though you might not be thinking of it in that way. I know in my country, people often think that this concept of Ubuntu is a South African concept. However, we know that it's not a South African concept. It's a concept that in literature we find in many countries from a sub-Saharan African perspective. And whether you're talking about most of East Africa, Central Africa, and Southern Africa. And of course, when we look beyond the manifestation of this concept, we also find its similarity in other contexts outside of the African continent. And as you indicated, Panos, Ubuntu, my favorite definition comes from Mzamo Mangaliso, who says it's about humaneness, and it's about a pervasive spirit of caring and of community, harmony and hospitality, respect and responsiveness that individuals or groups display for one another. So it's really by shifting the focus away from me as the leader, but to you as the community. So it's an others orientation, which is a very different kind of leadership to one that we've become accustomed to, particularly in this world of vulnerability, when leaders in society, particularly leaders in government within countries, have demonstrated that they want to first look after themselves and then look after their people, and only after that, look after the rest of the world. When in fact, that is not a very helpful way of seeing the world. And Ubuntu says, when we look after all of humanity, we actually look after ourselves. So you start externally first, you externalize your leadership, you externalize the benefits of your leadership. And again, you can see this in the idioms that represent this notion of Ubuntu. In South Africa, we say umuntu ngimuntu gabantu. In Kenya, they say mundu ni mundu ni undu wa andu. And I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly because I don't speak Kikuyu. And then in Botswana, they say muti kumutu kabatu babang. And of course, in Zimbabwe, munu nekuda kwewanu. So you can see that all of this is I am because you are. I am because we are. And of course, when we start recognizing that we are because of others, we live in community, we have a better sense of our role in society. And of course, historically, we have our leaders who have tried to bring this concept, if I can say, this cultural cognitive concept of Ubuntu, this philosophical concept of Ubuntu, they've tried to bring it into the political sphere. In our case, and I see Panos began with him, I should actually end with him because he comes at the end of this line of people. But in our case, we have former President Nelson Mandela, who after spending 27 years in jail, comes out preaching love and not hate. And he actually, he leans into the pain that took him there, not just him, but that incarcerated his people. So this notion of Ubuntu under Mandela was about love at the center of everything else. And then we have former President Julius Nyerere, when he speaks about this Swahili concept of Ujamaa, which is about familyhood. He's really reflecting and saying, I am challenging you to move away from this European concept of communism or socialism, which was based on class. And he's saying, I'm encouraging you to think about this notion of socialism being about people, humanity as a whole. And then when you get to Kwame Nkrumah, this notion of conscientism is about this notion of the emancipation of humanity. And Leopold Senghor spoke about challenging the institutional mechanisms that enable leadership. So, and then finally, you have someone like Kenneth Kaunda, who spoke about the humanist communitarianism, as well as Jomo Kenyatta, who spoke about this notion of Harambee, which is about pulling together or working together. So as in essence, our leaders were trying to bring this traditional philosophy out of the realm of spirituality, out of the realm of the ancient into the modern, but really saying it's not just about Africa, Panos, it's about humanity as a whole. So Ubuntu, whilst it's from Africa, is not about Africa. Ubuntu is about humanity. And of course, you see elements of this when you move into other contexts that are similar to Ubuntu. So the Maoris with the concept of waka papa, and there's this notion of being relational and being caring. This Wasta concept coming from the Arab community, this notion of connectivity, network, and influence. And so you make decisions through influence and not through authoritarianism. And of course, Buddhism teaches us about this notion of interdependence and interconnectedness. And if I may, for me, the strongest and most tightly linked to Ubuntu is Confucianism, and there are various other elements in Confucianism, which talks about this notion of Liji, which is about empathy, Xinyong, which is about trust, Ren, which is about humanity, and talks about Junzi, which is this notion of being a wholesome, ethical person. So you can see that in order to have Ubuntu, you must have this ethical wholesomeness, and you find the similar concepts in Confucianism. And so what's really interesting when you're thinking about this notion of Ubuntu in its traditional sense, and I see one of the speakers here is an Ubuntu, one of the delegates is an Ubuntu coach. I look forward to some of his comments when, if he so wishes to share later on, is this notion of you have the living, the dead, and the living dead. And so Ubuntu says, if you have Ubuntu, or as the Chinese says, if you have Junzi, you are a living person. But if you don't have Ubuntu and you are still alive, we call you a living dead. And the challenge with that is it's got both a positive and a negative dimension. The positive dimension is that it encourages people to seek to have Ubuntu. The negative dimension is that if I no longer see you as Ubuntu, as a person, because you lack Ubuntu, the risk, and we've seen elements of that in our country context, the risk is that you are no longer deserving of my humanity. And then the consequences can be very negative in very quickly. And so the challenge for us is we want to encourage everybody to really amplify the elements of Ubuntu, but don't over-romanticize this concept because it has a dark side. And we can talk about that if you so wish, Panos, later on. One of the comments you made when you introduced this webinar is you're encouraging people to think about how they can take things forward. What is it that they can take away with them? So with that in mind, I thought it might be useful to kind of anchor this conversation on Ubuntu in a different space. And with that space, I thought would be this notion, and forgive me, you did introduce me as a professor, to be a little bit academic, this notion of institutions. And there are really broadly in literature 3 concepts of institutions. Institutions are the regulatory framework, the laws that govern society, the normative framework, which is how we regulate ourselves through our norms and morality, and the cultural cognitive concepts. And this is the practices that we develop through time. And in our context, in an African context, I think those of us that live here, that do business here, that interact here, recognize that relative to the global north, we have weaker regulatory systems. Right? And so because we have weaker regulatory systems, we have to rely on normative and cultural systems to help us to make sense of the world, to help us to have order in society, to help us to engage, right? So Ubuntu then sits somewhere some of it sits in the normative space, and some of it sits in the cultural cognitive space. And so for me, as a leader, if I were one of you saying, I need to understand the cultural cognitive dimensions of Ubuntu, but much more importantly, I need to understand the mechanisms at a normative level, because it is these mechanisms that are going to help me as somebody who's operating in this space to use Ubuntu in a way that is positive and helpful. And so one of our past doctoral students, who is now Dr. Itai Muchoziwa from Zimbabwe, then did an amazing PhD, really trying to kind of bring a normative view to Ubuntu and develop a scale of how to assess and measure Ubuntu, and to help us to kind of think about the things that will help us to focus on the key issues of Ubuntu. And in this regard, she found out, after reviewing about 80 dimensions of Ubuntu, that the three main buckets is this notion of humaneness, this notion of interconnectedness, and this notion of compassion. And so what she means about on humaneness is that the belief that all people possess the innate characteristic of being human, which is being aware of self and others, and this notion being underpinned by respect and dignity. And I would like to think that in a communitarian environment where we put people first, this underpin of respect and dignity is important. So, and this notion of humaneness, one of the things you take away is that I must lead with respect. I must lead with dignity. Right? And then when you come to think about this notion of interconnectedness, is the idea that people are bound together by shared virtue, by their shared virtue of their humanity. So really understanding that unless we are all safe, I'm not safe. Unless we are all healthy, I'm not healthy. Right? So this notion of interconnectedness and inseparability, which you also find in Buddhism, then is another thing that I want you to take away with you, that we don't have African humans and Asian humans and European humans and so forth. We have humans. And actually, in order for humanity to thrive and to survive, we have to look after everyone, even people we don't like, because those people will have a negative impact on us if we consider them to be the living dead. So we actually have to bring everybody to see them as the living so that we can all survive as a humanity. And finally, for me, on this notion of compassion, I actually think this is the key underpin of Ubuntu that is not often spoken about. The first two, you find a lot of them in literature, but this one is underappreciated. And this notion of compassion, and if you can read it, and if you don't mind, it's about seeking us to go where it hurts, to enter places of pain, to share in brokenness, fear, confusion, and anguish. Compassion challenges us to cry out with those in misery, to mourn with those who are lonely, to weep with those in tears. It requires to be weak with the weak, vulnerable with the vulnerable, powerless with the powerless. So therefore, the idea of Ubuntu is not to be the strongest, but to be in solidarity with your people, to lead with solidarity, right? So not to be this hero leader, but to be an immersive leader, one who really understands the aspirations and dreams and fears of your people. And one of my favorite authors on the subject of Ubuntu is one of our own in our country, Dr. Ruo Koza, who reframes Ubuntu under this concept of attuned leadership. And then he gives us elements, examples of what we need to focus on as we think about how do I live this notion of Ubuntu. He says, not only must you be aware of who you are, and you must have emotional intelligence, but you must take this emotional intelligence and focus it externally to your people, to the needs and aspirations of your people. And as you do this thing of focusing to the needs and aspirations of your people, you must be driven by a moral ethic. And it must be ethically attuned. And in doing so, you must be attuned to history, meaning understand the history of each of the countries in which you operate, understand how that history has shaped your current reality, and how the combination of history and present and the choices that are being made is helping to shape destiny, to shape the future. And so the underpin for me in all of this, and I often listen to people when they're saying, when we're talking about normative concepts, Panos, they say, but normative stuff is contextual. And I warn against that, right? I warn against that because I don't believe things like respect, things like honesty, things like caring, things like fair-mindedness, things like justice require context. These are universal constructs. These are universal values. And these are the kinds of universal values that underpin Ubuntu. So therefore, when you're thinking about leadership leaning into a morally centered human being who's aware of the past and the present and who's seeking to shape the future, you then are encouraged to kind of tap into universal values that are important to all of humanity. And Ubuntu then guides you around how you do that. And ultimately, the last two slides in this part of the conversation really it talks about, if you go back to Itai's PhD, this idea of interconnectedness is that we need a leadership that emphasizes connection amongst others. So we're saying a leadership that emphasizes being attuned, a leadership that emphasizes being connected. And as Simon Hayward will say, connected leadership shifts a leader as a hero to a leader as a shared influence to achieve collective objectives. So therefore you see that it's about influencing, but not in a negative way, but it's about influencing from a position of understanding, from a position of serving. And talking about serving, finally, second last slide, I lied. My friend talks about service leadership. And in this notion of service leadership, he says, if serving is beneath you, then leadership is beyond you. When he's saying this, what he's suggesting is that as leaders, we should genuinely embrace that we are leading for others, not leading for ourselves. We are leading for our community. We are leading for our societies. And therefore, the benefits of that leadership need to accrue to our society, need to accrue to our people, and not to ourselves. And as we're doing all of this, as I conclude, going back to where we started, Panos and I keep on going back to Nelson Mandela, I believe for me, Ubuntu invites us to make choices that reflect our hopes and not choices that reflect our fears. Because with choices that reflect our hopes, we are looking after all of humanity, or Gesizulu, all of Abantu, or all of the Muntu, all of the people, and not some of the people. Thank you, Panos. Let me stop here, and then we can be in conversation. I'll stop sharing. Thank you so much.
Professor Mthombeni, thank you so much for sharing these really inspiring words. I would say words that in some ways goes contrary to everything else that is happening in our times, where there's so much competitiveness, speed. We live in a world where it's good to remind ourselves of these values. You spoke about caring, respect, responsiveness, ethically attuned. Brought in so many values that, as you said, are universal values, very important for all of us, and particularly important for the humanitarian development sector where we work, where these values drive our work as we go through. I have I've received a number of questions, but before I go into questions, I want to let you all know that while I'm asking the questions, there would be a number of quizzes that would appear on the screen. We're just trying to get a sense of who is in this webinar right now and where you're calling from. So bear with us as you go, and please give us your feedback on the polls as they appear. There is 2 or 3 of them. We'll try to get through them very quickly, and please keep on sending questions. I already have a few to start with, but use the Q&A box or the chat box to share your question. Professor, I'd like to start with the first question that we got from James in the US, who is really, his question is, how can one integrate this leadership and empowerment into my organizational culture? So really brings the question of the individual, Ubuntu, and then the culture of the organization that one is working. Over to you.
So thank you. James, I see you say you're from the US, and so allow me to maybe be heuristic and take a chance. I imagine you come out of a culture that emphasizes a notion of competitive advantage. And in order to succeed, right? So as a strategist, I understand this concept of competitive advantage. Ubuntu, on the other hand, invites us, James, to introduce a different concept. And it's a concept of collaborative advantage. And what that collaborative advantage says is, do you have the ability to build partnerships, partnerships across divides, and then use those partnerships to solve really important problems? Because what we know is that the problems that we are faced with are not simple problems, they're very complex problems. And in fact, most of problems of society are problems of complexity, and we make the mistake of trying to oversimplify those problems of complexity. So for me, one of the first things that you can do, James, is to maybe introduce a concept of greater collaboration in our organizations as opposed to greater competition in our organizations. And then underpin that notion of collaborative advantage is this idea of psychological safety in organizations. If organizations can invest a great deal of effort in building a psychologically safe environment where diversity, equity, and inclusion are at the core of how you run your organization, you then are starting to practice elements of Ubuntu. And in one of our 11 official languages in our country, in Zulu, there's a greeting that we use, just a final word. There's a greeting that we use, and that greeting is Sawubona, all right? And what Sawubona means is, I see you. And therefore, what it really means in your context, James, is start by seeing people. And I mean, really seeing people in their true essence and celebrating who they are in as much as they will see you and celebrate who you are. Hope that helps, James.
Great, thank you. We're receiving more and more questions. Please keep on sending your questions. I'm going to go to the second one. And the second one is from Paula, who is in Sudan. And she's saying, as a humanitarian organization that looks at helping people who are vulnerable, how does this interplay with our sense of Ubuntu and its emphasis on community?
So I'm very cautious to speak as a humanitarian. I'm an educator, but I don't know that I qualify to speak as a humanitarian. However, theoretically, what I could suggest, Panos, is we often, when people go and help, right? Whether I'm helping as an educator or you're helping as a humanitarian, one of the big mistakes we can make is to think, one, we understand what help is required. Two, how that help is required. And therefore, when we arrive and are giving this help and it doesn't get received well, and it gets rejected, it can be very debilitating. Therefore, what in the context of Ubuntu is you go into a space of helping with a learning mindset. And you first learn, you listen, you negotiate, you seek to understand, you seek to establish with the people that are looking for help to say, is this the kind of help that you need? And in doing so, then you are co-creating the help with those that are in need of that help. And then because it's co-created, there's greater sense of impact in that help, right? So then when you kind of take it from that point of view, then in that sense, then Ubuntu is about taking it to that compassion space. So it requires you to lean into their pain, live their pain. So not just talk their pain, live their pain. And as you live their pain, you say, this is how I think we could solve this together. Of course, there's this stuff called governance. And so you need to then go back and then say, how do I then bring this innovative solutions that are bottom up, that are from the people to align with the governance mechanisms that have brought us there?
Beautifully said. And indeed is, putting the people in the center and really ensuring that respect and dignity is in place. I have a question from Samantha. Samantha says, I love the concept of Ubuntu. How does it relate to self-care, self-management? Does one need to take care of oneself before taking care of others?
So I suppose when we are talking, it's about the risk of a linear way of seeing the world compared to a complex way of seeing the world. In my view, when you go back to the underpinning principles of respect and dignity, that's where this kind of the solution lies around self-care and caring for others. So as long as what you're doing is underpinned by this notion of respecting yourself in order to respect others, living a life of dignity in order to infer a life of dignity onto others. So therefore, self-care and looking after others are not separable, they are intertwined. So I suppose that's what I'm trying to explain, that it's not a linear thing of do one before you do the other. It's a thing of in doing one, you are doing the other. So the circles are interlinked, so to speak. And I hope that helps. And I hope it's not as confusing as maybe it sounds as I'm expressing it. But I think for me, the challenge in what I learned when I did my doctorate and my MBA is that the Western approaches to leadership like to simplify and linearize how the world actually works. And I don't even think even in the West, the world is linear, but the tools that we have in things like transformational leadership or in tools like charismatic leadership suggest a very linear relationship, whereas Ubuntu is suggesting that the self-care comes in you loving your people and in you loving yourself. And these things have to happen at the same time.
Thank you. That's very, very clear, this integration. I have another question from Michael. Michael is asking, how can Ubuntu be applied practically in cultures which promote individualism and which are highly competitive?
Yeah, this is a deep normative question. And I suppose one way of looking at it is this notion of self-interest that you find in the highly individualistic societies. And I think when there was an abundance of resources, Panos, we could simplify self-interest and high individualism and put a stereotype around them. But in a world where we don't have an abundance of resources anymore, in a world where we don't have an abundance of water, an abundance of energy, an abundance of our environment, in that world, even these highly individualistic societies are coming to recognize that for them to survive, it's in their self-interest to actually embrace a more community-centric way of thinking about the world. And I would imagine the key to that through Ubuntu, if you go back to Ruel Khoza, is going back to this notion of being morally centered and ethically aware. And in the individualistic world, there is a range of possibility about what ethics means, from this highly individualistic worldview of ethics to a communitarian view of ethics. And I would say for me, a good conversation would be to start by having an ethical conversation, because it may be hard to go to the US or go to the UK and talk about Ubuntu and have people take you seriously. But if you talk about leadership and ethics, you then start bringing in elements of Ubuntu in a culturally convenient way in your context.
Great, thank you. It's wonderful to see so many questions coming. So I'll keep on going on with the questions, and maybe keep your answers.
But maybe I might also want to ask you a question, but just bear that in mind, Panos, because we want to keep it dynamic and happening.
With pleasure, with pleasure. So Joanne is saying, what are some of the the measures of a leader who lives Ubuntu principles in the workplace? So it's about these measures that demonstrated in a leader who lives by the Ubuntu principles.
Yeah, so as I indicated in my presentation piece, amongst others is, do you create a psychologically safe environment in your organization? And maybe a practical example of that is, do you encourage dissent? do you encourage people to challenge in your organization? Do you encourage people to speak out in your organization? And as you do all of these things, and you can do all of these things, and I come from more of a business sector and still achieve a profit, right? So it's not like these things are at the expense of achieving organizational objectives, even if those organizational objectives are of a commercial nature, right? So it's another, what kind of culture do you develop in your organization as a leader? Right? And I'd be very happy, as you know, Panos, to share that tool that Itai has developed as an Ubuntu leadership scale that the Geli community can use to assess themselves. But at a very high level, it's really about developing that notion of psychological safety that allows people to really share in a forward-looking, humane way some of their fears and aspirations.
Thank you. I have another question from Mohammed, who is clearly inspired by all the values you've articulated as part of Ubuntu. And his question is, any insights as to why we're losing these values?
Yeah, so I suppose it goes back to what I was talking about in terms of this notion of a systems view or an institutional view in society. So leadership is one aspect, but then you say, what is the systems in which you're operating in? And so what are the rules and the regulatory framework? What is the norms that underpin that? And what are the cultural dynamics in which you're operating? And I think what we're finding is that, firstly, and I see there's a comment here, I can't remember who it was saying that they have, in Liberia, they have a storytelling culture. I think it's, this is Sarah from Nepal. So, and it says in Liberia, they've got a storytelling culture. And I think for me, the difficulty is we leaders are no longer telling the stories. We're no longer contributing to the narrative, right? And so what are the new institutions that are creating the narrative? For me, it's this new world of social media and the interweb, where the people that are in charge of, that are in control of the narrative, they themselves haven't earned the right to be in charge of that narrative. And I'm sure I'll be criticized for this because for academic snobbery or leadership snobbery. But at the end of the day, I learned a lot about my leadership from my elders. I learned from my grandparents. I learned from my parents, my granduncles, people that have lived, that had experience, and as a consequence of experience of life, could really share through storytelling some of the underpinnings of these values. Today, we as parents have outsourced the values that our children have to devices like these, right? We've outsourced, and our children learn from people that we don't know who they are and what they stand for. So I would say personally, we need to be storytellers. We need to go back and reinsert ourselves into the narratives that are taking place. We need to disrupt the conversations that are taking place in the ether and come back with stories and that are valuable, that are interesting, that our young people in organizations, young people in society are interested to know and learn about, and so that they can too carry those stories going forward.
Absolutely. I have a question from Paula who's asking, how does Ubuntu relate to gender? And I want to link it to a comment earlier on when you put all the samples of leaders and they were all male, and surely there's also a lot of female there. So if you could elaborate a little bit about Ubuntu and gender.
So like most things in life, they are products of their society and they also evolve, right? So what we know about leadership in an African context is in what is available to us from a historical perspective. In many African countries, it's highly gendered, very male-centric, right? But it does not mean that women leaders, one, did not exist, and two do not exist. So there are women leaders that have been around as historical figures, and there are women leaders today who are around as contemporary figures. So in essence, my understanding of Ubuntu is that it is gender neutral in the sense that it doesn't require people to be gendered in their roles. However, it is a product of humanity's gendered context, gendered past, right? But given its universalistic, humanistic approach to life philosophy, and in this context, to leadership, it allows us to actually, it allows us to overcome some of our gendered perspectives that we have in our society. And I suppose in an African context, this is a real problem. Much of South Africa is homophobic. Much of South Africa does not look after its women. Much of South Africa doesn't even, not South Africa, much of Africa doesn't even think about concepts like transgender, for example. So as a consequence, I believe Ubuntu has an opportunity to make a positive contribution there, but it has not been playing in that space, in my view.
Thank you, very clear. I have another question from Ida. So Ida is asking, how can we better advocate integration of Ubuntu leadership in the humanitarian sector, where speed, centralized systems are prioritized, perhaps at the expense of listening, at the expense of diversity, and at the expense of inclusion? So over to you.
So ask that again, so because there was a lot of words there, Panos.
It is. So Ida's question is basically in the humanitarian sector, where we're a sector where we have to move very fast. Speed is of essence to delivering life-saving assistance. Also, we're very centralized at the capital or the headquarters level. So where you need that speed, and when you have that centralization, sometimes for the sake of speed, we don't listen enough. We're not inclusive enough. So her question is how basically to square the circle in between speed and bureaucratic centralized system and the Ubuntu principles, which would require us, of course, to take the time to listen and to show these values that you articulated.
So I suppose it depends on your objective, Panos, in life. Do you want a quick solution or do you want a lasting solution? And of course, Ubuntu is just like a nail. It can't solve just like a hammer, it can't solve every problem. And so you will find in a crisis and you're looking for a quick solution, perhaps there's no time to listen. There's no time to engage. There's time for action. In that space, you need a different tool, right? But if outside of those crisis situations, I would imagine in the humanitarian spaces, I don't know, Panos, you can help me here. Is everything about crisis or are there things that are not about crisis, right? So in outside of a deeply crisis scenario where the building is burning or there's been a huge flood, whatever the case might be, when you're dealing with a longer term humanitarian crises, like you're dealing with refugees and people that have been displaced and so forth. I think the opportunity there around Ubuntu is to introduce this concept of agile governance. Because in my view, Panos, when I listen to you talking about centralized bureaucratic decision-making, need for speed, I'm hearing rigid governance. All right. And I think the opportunity is to think about this notion of agile governance, what we mean by agile governance, to introduce a concept which is more of a principles-based than rules-based. Right? And in a rules-based governance framework, you have rigidity and things can be very slow. There's not a lot of time for engaging and listening and learning. Whereas in a principles-based agile governance framework, you have that ability to kind of say, this is our initial idea of what we think we're going to do, but we're going to go into the environment and learn quickly and then bring back a revised idea. And then the governance framework should have an ability to absorb that. It's a huge challenge for large organizations that are represented in the Gaelic community. But I would strongly recommend that we investigate this notion of agile governance.
Thank you. I'm going to pass the question from what must be our youngest listener, Tikiri, who is 11 years old, and is asking. You talked about the Ubuntu principle and really engaging, loving the people who we may not like. And her question is, how can you engage with someone you don't like and love that person?
Yeah. This is the thing. If I like someone, I love someone, I don't have to compromise, because what is happening there is we are in agreement. There's not a lot of conflict. I know the psychologists are going to challenge me that there's a lot of conflict in love, but very simplistically speaking, when people like each other, they find each other very quickly, right? There's not a lot of conflict involved in that, right? However, a real leadership happens when you are dealing with people you don't like. And often problems around resources are when people who don't like each other are competing for resources. And so the idea then of Ubuntu then says, as I lean into your problems with compassion, Tikiri, I must understand your worldview without losing my worldview. I need to understand your worldview. And as I understand this worldview, it might inform how I approach the problem differently. So in other words, I must feel your pain and then encourage you to feel my pain. And as we're exchanging each other's pain, we start co-creating a new meaning, and that new meaning allows us to find new solutions. And even after we found those solutions, it doesn't mean that we're going to suddenly like each other. It just means that we found a solution to share these resources in a way that doesn't lead to a zero-sum game, in a way that doesn't lead to us killing each other. It means that we are going to live side by side, next to each other, eat from the same table, continue maybe to be skeptical of each other, but make sure that we assure our common existence, our continued existence, because Umuntu, Gumuntu, Gabantu, because a person exists through other people. And so this notion of hatred means that we have an assured destruction. All right. So I hope, Tikiri, that is a helpful way of helping you to understand it. I'm not saying for a second that you're going to like everyone that you work with, but I'm suggesting that understand Ubuntu invites you into a real leadership, not a beauty parade, and not a space to be an influencer on social media, but to really influence in society, to influence with problems that really matter.
Thank you. It makes a lot of sense, and certainly in our sector as well, where we often have to interact with a lot of people whose views we don't embrace, but that approach to be able to find a common ground is really important. I have another question. And the listener is saying, could you share countries, organizations, or contemporary leaders who are truly living by the concept of Ubuntu? And I want to say, while you're answering, colleagues who are attending this webinar, you will see a quiz asking your feedback as we're getting in the last 10 minutes of the webinar. So please, and I'm going to take more questions, but you will see in the screen that quiz that comes out. So examples of leaders and countries.
Yeah, so I'm going to be a bit biased, Panos, and given what's been happening over the last few days in our country, South Africa, that is, and also in our sister country, Botswana, that is, right? So you've got two countries with their leaders, ours, of course, being President Ramaphosa, who have taken a principled decision, right, to share the knowledge that they have in the interests of society, in the interests of humanity, in its totality, in terms of the new virus, without for a second thinking about the consequences to their own people. So in other words, they were outwardly focused in sharing that we as a humanity have this problem, And for me, at a country level, that's a very good example of political leaders living Ubuntu. Now, of course, as I put up these examples, I'm not suggesting that these human beings are perfect, they're the epitome of Ubuntu, but I'm saying through that action, those are actions of Ubuntu, right? Looking after all of humanity, even at the expense of your own family, right? And then when I look at also what we've been through in our country, we had many businesses, leaders in business giving of their time over the past 20 months to solve social problems, whether they were COVID related or political unrest related, and an extremely generous act in a different time, but an extremely necessary act in current times. So here we have got an organization called Business for South Africa, and this organization has worked hard to mobilize health care materials, resources, medications, and so forth, not only for South Africa, but for our region, right? And so for me, these are examples of actions of Ubuntu. So you will notice, Panos, as I'm answering you, I can give you many examples of actions of Ubuntu. What I don't want to do is to put up human beings as these people are living embodiments of Ubuntu. And part of the reason I don't want to do that, I'm inspired by Nelson Mandela, who says he abhorred the idea of being considered a saint. Instead, what he appreciated is he needs to be judged for his actions, good and bad. And his legacy should not be static. His legacy should be dynamic. And from time to time, people must constantly be assessing the actions with the lenses, both of the time when those actions were made, but with the lenses of the time in which they're being analyzed. So in essence, I think if you turn around and you look at each of your countries and each of your contexts, you will find examples of actions of Ubuntu. And these are selfless actions. And we can go back all the way to Mother Teresa and others to kind of think of selfless actions. And I'm sure there are many Mother Teresas on this call, people that are doing selfless actions every day. And here's the key message. These are not epitomes of Ubuntu. These are ordinary human beings who make mistakes, who fall, who are selfish, and who are giving. But they every day make choices that they will have an act of Ubuntu. So I would encourage all of us to look around us and look for actions of Ubuntu and encourage ourselves to do acts of Ubuntu, which is an others orientation.
Wow, this is very inspirational. Finding the acts of Ubuntu in our environment, wherever we are, and actually to put it in practice and what an impact this would have. I have what is my last question, because really we only have about 3 minutes left. And Nina from Mali is saying, where can we find coaching resources to better integrate the Ubuntu philosophy in our day-to-day life, including in leadership?
The answer is on the chat, Panos. There's a guy called Dumi Magadela, who says, for training on Ubuntu coaching, check out Ubuntu coaching. It's also accredited by the International Coaching Federation. So please go to that and go to the chat. You'll see the details there on this coaching session on Ubuntu. So thank you. I'm so glad I didn't have to answer that question to my brother from another mother who comes up with an answer as we need it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I think the last one is Gisela, who is asking you for any recommendation you give to all the leaders who are on this call on one practical Ubuntu leadership step that they could take with themselves and their teams.
I suppose I'll go back to my colleague who did her PhD with us and say, just remember, you are not an island. You are interconnected with your organizations and your customers and your suppliers. So when you are leading, don't lead and say, what is in it for me? Lead with, what can I give to my community? What can I give to my employees? What can I give to my suppliers to make their life easier? Now, interesting point, Panos, in behavioral economics is this notion that you need to do two things. And you'll be surprised, time and time again, humanity responds well. If you want something from people, give them something. And give them a lot of something. But people don't like receiving stuff for free. It's an amazing psychological thing. Once they've received something, they feel an obligation to give back. Therefore, if you genuinely want something from people, go and give them a lot of your Ubuntu, and you will receive even much more than what you have given because of this cognitive dimension of reciprocity. Right? And Ubuntu is underpinned by this cognitive dimension of reciprocity.
Wow, wonderful. So with that, colleagues, we're coming towards the end of this webinar. I really like to thank Professor Maurice Mthombeni for his words of wisdom and really sharing with us the Ubuntu leadership, the Ubuntu philosophy, which is really a universal values, people-based. We thank you for this inspirational talk you shared with us and wish you the very, very best. I want to let our colleagues that this webinar was recorded. We will be sharing it back with all of you who have registered. Please stay tuned to future webinars as we were preparing with Gelly, and we would also love to hear from you any thoughts and suggestions for future topics. I want to say very sorry to all of you. We couldn't take all the questions. There were so many of them, but wish you the very best with where you are. And Professor Mthombeni, your last word before you close.
So through my family, I've been introduced to the Indian community, and one of my favorite words as I say goodbye to everybody is namaste. Thank you.
Namaste. Thank you. Goodbye to all of you, and wish you all the best. Goodbye. This brings a closure to this webinar.